Okay, so just welcome back to part 2. Now we're up to explain the message of source 3. So with this one, it is a little bit, it's a little bit more than just saying, okay, this is the message. So what you're going to notice is on the marking key, you're going to see that, and I'll just see my little cursor move around it, you've got 3 for explaining it, 2 for outlining it, and 1 just for identifying it. So what you want to look here, a good answer should have all of these things here. So coming down to the pink area, that's what you want to have a look on. So you want to actually say, well, who produced it? So your title, your date, and your origin. So who produced it? What's the title? What's the date? And that's just what's on your source, okay? The issue, subject, event conveyed by source 3 is, and you're using examples from the source. Now that's just identifying the issue / event / subject. So that means you're not conveying all 3, you're just choosing one. Then you want to actually look at, and you've got to use examples from the source, you want to look at the representation or the opinion being expressed. So the author is expressing the opinion that, and that could be that all the Jews are bad, if you're looking at a Hitler one, or that the Weimar Republic is to blame for the Treaty of Versailles. Now that he or she, or whoever's the author, might be expressing an opinion. Or it might be the author might be representing an idea. So that the message could be they're representing, the Nazis in a certain way. Or it could be the other way, where the representation is to do something visual. So if you're looking at a visual source, which you often are for this one, then what are they trying to represent in that visual source? So what are they presenting to you? What ideas are sitting behind it? So that's what you might want to look at. Now you might have a visual source from a political propaganda poster that the Nazis put out for elections, and you would say they might be representing the Jews as being the scapegoats, as being the people to blame for the Weimar Republic, or for the hyperinflation, or for the Weimar Republic not working well, or basically everything that's wrong with society. So they will either express an opinion if it's a written, or they'll be representing an idea. If it's a visual source. So it just depends on the type of source for that. And again, this one, a message can be interpreted so many different ways, so you need to use examples from the source. And that really gives you a full mark. If you were just to say the message of source 3 is, bang, you probably get 1 mark out of 3. So try and leverage up those marks as much as you can, especially on these fairly shorter questions. Okay, so this is one of the hardest ones, I think, is identifying how and discussing why source 3 and source 4 are contestable. So source 3 you've already looked at in message, and then of course source 4 is at the end of your document study. Now there's a couple of ways we can do this. It's where's 6? Okay, so it's a really big idea to try and get your head around, and it's a really hard thing sometimes to sort of get right the first time. So it's really good, really important that you do actually understand this question and come and see me if you don't. But it's also really important that you probably use the scaffolds and the sentence starters that I've given you. So basically here, note the concept of contestability requires a discussion of conflicting historical interpretations if they're represented in source material, why they are different and open to debate. Now that's going to depend on the source material you get. Sometimes when you're starting out, you might just get sources that are excessively biased. And that's sort of how we start you out. But as you go along in your studies of history, especially next year in Year 12, you must understand that each interpretation belongs to a particular school of thought. And we're going to look at that probably in more detail as we go forward. Definitely by your exam, you would have those down pat, and I will teach those through. And that's things like different types of arguments that could be for and against, different ideas about, the blame for something, different ideas in what's significant or what's not, different ideas on what was the cause. What was the overall cause of, maybe the Nazis gaining power? And because there's so many things going on, at once in history with events and social things and economic and ideas going around, what tends to happen is that we can classify these arguments into, or interpretations into, streams. So you've got to be able to show that you understand what can make it contestable, and there's really a few ways that it can happen. It's whether it provides a certain interpretation for which others exists. So if one source is saying Hitler, all of Hitler's problems were to blame was, he's losing his father at an early age, or losing his mother at an early age and not getting on with his father, then that could be one person's interpretation. If it can be contested, it might be the fact that his rejection in an art school was the catalyst for him becoming, going on this path. Others might say, well, no, it was World War One. Some people might say, no, it was because the Nazi Party were just telling people what they wanted to hear, and that Hitler really didn't have a lot to do with it. So you're going to get this. There's always another interpretation. So it's recognizing that in your sources. The other one is that whether a source itself can be disputed as historical evidence. And what that means is, can it be challenged? Is it hugely accurate in some ways? Now, if there's a bias in a source, it doesn't necessarily mean that it can be challenged. It just means that there is a little bit of a bias in terms of, maybe you've got a particular point of view that's infecting it. So, I'm a middle-class white woman, and my point of view is going to try and be balanced because that's what I'm used to. Whereas if I was born in Germany, even now my point of view would be very different, and that's that sort of a bit of bias that you'll see. When a piece of evidence can be disputed, then the bias would be extreme. So that's propaganda. So propaganda is going to tell us a lot, but it can be disputed as a piece of evidence to say, well, if you're using propaganda as all your evidence to construct a historical event, then people are going to look at it and go, well, hang on, the purpose of propaganda is to distort and manipulate the viewer's opinion. So it might not be that you've got quite, some good sources there to show us something. So it's sort of having a look at which one it is. Now, it can be both, or it can be just one. The fact there's other interpretations, or the fact that it's extremely biased, or it can be both together. That's the skill in what you're looking at there. So what you need to do is look at the argument, look at the bias, and look at the motive. That all comes into a discussion. So it says here, stronger candidates may discuss the nature of contestability, perhaps by referring to alternate arguments or viewpoints on the interpretations, or by making comparisons between the two sources. So at this first go, you would be making comparisons between the two sources. They will link in together at one point. Okay, so this little one here is what you can write, and because it actually shows that you understand what contestability means, it's a nice little mark. So you could basically write, there's two options here. You could write a source is contestable if, and then you talk about it. It provides an interpretation of events, or its validity as historical evidence can be disputed, and then you would use the examples from the sources to support your points. So you can do that. You can separate that out. Source 3 is contestable due to the fact that its validity as historical evidence can be disputed, due to the fact that it's excessively biased, and then you give an example from your source. Source 4 is contestable due to the fact that it has one interpretation of events, which is known to be from the determinist stream, however, and then you have an example. However, there is another alternative perception or interpretation of these events, and that is the determinist school. Now, I know it sounds a little bit strange, but you will learn about these coming forward, so it won't seem so weird, but that's kind of the type of thing. Then you can have a little chat about both of them. You might want to make an observation if they work together. You might want to have a look at those ideas of motive and bias, and you kind of pull that out a little bit, because then that gives you those higher marks as well. So just sort of looking at here, some of the tips in yellow, what can you have a look at? What arguments are being put by each author, have a look at the point of view, like where's it coming from? Is that going to influence this particular version of events? The purpose is very important, or the motive. Obviously, if you're going to get something from Hitler himself, it might be very different to an historian. Or if you're going to get something from an eyewitness, what's their motive behind that? Are they just going to tell you about it? Do they want money off it? Are they going to embellish? Kind of tap into that. It's a really good reason as to why something is contestable. You can have a look at the accuracy. And again, looking at propaganda, if it's excessively biased, it might be persuading, but it might not be accurate. How accurate is it that the Jews were the main problem in the economic system prior to 1933? How accurate is it that Hitler, drew the party together all by himself and that no one else was involved? How accurate is it that he is this fantastic and charismatic speaker? So that's the kind of thing you want to have a look at, and of course any excessive bias. So now we come along to our biggest question, worth 7 marks. And this one here is really important to actually use this marking key as a little bit of a scaffold. Because one of the things here is, and I've highlighted it in yellow, the common mistake here is that people just talk about what's in the source. And actually, there is really only 1 mark for that. So you can literally, if you spend all your time talking about the sources and what they've got in them, you'll get 1 mark out of 7. And that's a hugely common mistake in this question. So you don't really want to make this mistake. What the question is asking you to do, your action word here is evaluate the importance of the themes, ideas, and or events represented in the 4 sources. So that's the first thing you've got to identify. You can absolutely use the some examples if you think it will work from the source, but you've actually got to evaluate, which means you've actually got to rank it. How important are they in the scheme of what's happening at the whole time period? So how important is the Munich Beer Hall push in the development of the Nazi Party through to 1928? And you can talk about the impact of Hitler being imprisoned and his trial. You'd have to fit it into that. Now, those things might not be in your source set, but you've actually got to discuss what's in your sources with what's happening in the bigger picture. So that's really combining like your source analysis and what you already know about the period. So you've got to identify those themes, ideas, and events. And what you'll find is that the document set is often what we call thematic. It makes it easier for us to construct it, and it makes it easier for you guys to answer this particular question. So the theme of one for Nazi Germany might be life in society. And you might have some social aspects, some social policies, you might have some personal accounts, and you might have some pictures on that one there. So that will be in that one. And so then what you're going to do is identify the themes, and again, it's evaluating those sort of ideas. So you've got to have a look at the long-term and the short-term effects of the theme, idea, and event, and then you've got to look at your continuity and change. Okay, so really going through this scaffold is the thing you have to do for this one in order to actually understand it and get that one right. And the thing is too, you've got to make sure you're looking at your continuity. So let's go down. Whoops, doesn't like me. Let's go down to the scaffold for this one. Okay, so here we are at that scaffold. Okay, so you just want to outline your theme, events, ideas represented, and then you've really got to look at the importance. So the next sentence will be the importance of the ideas depicted in the sources, and group them together. So you might go, the importance of the ideas depicted in source 1 and 2 is that it shows, or that it was the idea that Hitler was a charismatic speaker. This is crucial to an understanding of the early Nazi period, to get a better understanding of how Hitler may have worked to gain support and to gain standing within the Nazi parties. And then you would have a look, this is extremely important at this time as Hitler was trying to gain that support, and then you would use the examples from the sources. So you make a judgment. However, whilst the Munich beer hall push that's represented in sources 3 and 4 is important. It's more important in the fact that it was a failure, but then, you know, Hitler was able to learn from that. And then you might want to talk about, have a little example from the source, but then you might want to actually say, well, this is not as important. That really what was more important was the fact that he was able to spend time in prison, develop his manifesto, and he understood he had to work from within the system. So you might say it's hugely important as its impact, but it maybe wasn't such an important event at the time. And then you would discuss that. So it's really up to you what you're getting and what you already know about the period. So in the events depicted in the sources had a dramatic short-term effect on. So then you can have a look at what happened at the time. So, you know, it had a dramatic short-term effect on the Nazi Party, but not much else, in the fact that, you know, it was able to develop and grow from strength from there, as evidenced by the 1928 election when they had some improvement, and, you know, go on and show what you know there. So is there anything that's continued? That's that change in continuity. Whilst long terms, these effects are still with us today. You know, with the devastation, with the fact that, you know, Mein Kampf is no longer legal to buy in Germany, the fact that, you know, Hitler has left a lasting legacy of hate, and, you know, that basically Nazi Germany is one of the most written, or Hitler himself is one of the most written about historical figures, you know, and, you know, all kinds of stuff. I mean, you might want to have a look at the long term first about how then this change in strategy would have eventually led them to success, and then you might want to look at the continuity, so what's still happening today. So when you're given a source sort of prep, when in your prep you're normally given a source focus, so this is the content you want to focus on, you need to just kind of think about and research, okay, well, what's happening today? Is there anything still happening today? Is there some way I can bring that through? Or maybe what's the impact of these ideas and events a little bit further? Now, if they're not represented in the 4 sources and you think there's another idea or event from that time that's more important, then you're putting it in here. So it's what you know and what the sources are telling you for this one. So just suggested approach down here is in blue. So you can have a look, identify the main events, people, ideas, etc. Discuss how they're important. And you can have a look for different things. For an event, results or consequences. For a person, individuals' deeds and the significance of their action. For an idea, economic, political and social changes. So that's a little bit of an extra thing down there. So maybe also making sure you're revising that is really important. So that's it for the 5 questions. Obviously, you want to time them out. And, you know, you want to, so you know you've got 50 minutes. So normally your suggested working times are between 9 and 11 minutes for your back questions that are worth more, and anything between 4 and 7 for the other questions. And you kind of want to start looking at how much time you're spending on them. So this is just a few kind of general strategies for interpreting different types of documents. So, you know, a couple of things you can do. Highlight the instruction words. So if it's asking you to evaluate, identify, describe, assess, they're all different things. So have a look at that. Again, compare, contrast, explain, discuss, evaluate. Highlight the year of publication. It will often help you to identify the people, especially if it's context. Now, having a look at the year is really important because you might look at something from 1924. You know that in 1923 they had the hyperinflation in the Ruhr, there was the invasion. So you might go, okay, well, that might play into that. Or you know that by 1924, you know, basically Hitler's pretty much sentenced by then. The beer hall push is over. But you also know that around about 1919 was when he was starting to come into contact with the Nazi Party. So just use those things as cues. The author and the publisher of the source should also be highlighted. So when you're kind of having a read through, pay attention to these kind of things. So then you can, with your annotating, highlight the words and phrases that show the key points and ideas being presented by the author. That way you're getting that ready for that end question. And you can then write that around the source. So you write that first off so you don't forget it for later. So you're doing a lot of your thinking out on the page, which is such a good idea. So have a little think about the tone. Is it praising, critical, sarcastic, ironic? That will help with purpose as well. It helps to identify that. And it also shows bias or point of view. If you've got cartoons, is there any captions or labels or speech bubbles? Have a look at countries, individuals, stereotypes, groups, events, organisations. How has the cartoonist portrayed the events and people? Is it positive? Is it negative? Have a look at accuracy and fairness. And that also applies to paintings and photographs. So, how accurate is it? What sort of individuals are represented here in these? Okay, statistics. You want to have a look at the rate and extent of economic, political, or social change. You need to see if there's any upward or downward trends, peaks and troughs, unexpected or extreme values. Why have they published these statistics? Is it biased? Can you trust it? So basically, as Mark Twain once said, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. They can be manipulated and have been in the past. So having a look at things like purpose, motive. So, propaganda, it's to mislead. Commentary, it's, to have a look at that. It's interpretation. It's, having a look at direct involvement, explain, justify, place in time. Okay, so it's perspectives and how that can change. Perspectives are going to be different compared to what they are now as to what they were at the time. So, that sort of thing is going to be really different. For example, a historian assessing the importance of Vanderbilt 100 years is going to be really different to someone that is looking at a historian that's written it in the Great Depression. And it's the same with Nazi Germany. So, someone that's writing of the time, especially even in 1950, which is only 5 years after the war, is going to have a very different opinion to someone that's writing about it today. Because again, that benefit of hindsight, there's more that's come out, there's more to research. The emotion of the period has lessened. It does seem further away. It might not have repeated itself. If it has repeated itself, then, there's issues in that, and that can infect or influence our perception. So hopefully that lecture is helpful. Please come and see me if you have any further questions. The best advice I can give you is to practice, and I have a practice source set for your first one for Unit 2, and even give constructing your own a go, because it really makes you think about what the questions are going to be like. And definitely come and see me if you need a hand, but don't forget about this book. Don't forget about this lecture, and use them as part of your study prep. Thank you for listening.